They say there are certain screams that never stop echoing, even after the throats that made them have long since gone silent. Picture the summer of 1462. The air was heavy, the heat suffocating, and you, an Ottoman soldier forged in the greatest army the world has ever seen, marched with the confidence of someone who has cracked empires open like shells. You have stood inside Constantinople after its fall, witnessed cities crumble before your banners, and walked through smoke-blackened ruins, knowing no force in Europe can stand against the rising shadow of your sultan. Waqia is nothing more than a troublesome corner of land, a minor principality ruled by a defiant prince who should have been crushed years ago. The campaign should be swift, predictable, and routine, lasting days, perhaps weeks at most. Yet something shifts before you even see the enemy. It starts as a smell drifting across the wind, thick, cloying, and rancid with decay. So unnatural that the horses begin to resist their riders and the hardened men around you fall into an uneasy silence. The column slows, then stalls entirely as the scouts ahead refuse to move another step. When your unit finally rounds a small ridge overlooking the capital's outskirts, the answer to their hesitation rises before you in a vision that does not belong to the world of the living. A forest stretches across the hills, but the trees have no leaves, no branches, and no bark. They are bodies, human bodies raised on wooden stakes, arranged in precise geometric rows that reach so far into the horizon that the sky itself seems disturbed by them. Some have already surrendered to rot, their flesh blackened and swollen. Others still writhe, weakly, their faint, broken voices merging with the wind in a chorus of agony that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. Your Sultan, the conqueror of the Byzantine world, the man whose armies have shattered kingdoms, stops his horse and stares in wordless silence. Because this sight is not simply brutal, it is engineered, it is deliberate. It is a message carved into thousands of bodies, and the dread curling in your stomach is not the dread of defeat, but the dread of realizing that whoever created this horror did not act from madness. He acted from strategy, cold, meticulous, merciless strategy. The tale you think you know about Vlad the Impaler is a shadow of the real one. Because the truth is darker than the legends, more calculated than the myths, and far more terrifying than the stories whispered long after the fires went out. This is not simply what he did to Bodhi's. This is what he did to mine. To understand how a man becomes capable of engineering something as grotesque as a forest of human bodies, you have to return to the moment when his childhood was not merely interrupted, but violently rearranged by the ambitions of men who saw kingdoms as bargaining chips. In the year 1442, Vlad was only 11. Still young enough to believe the world might offer safety if he clung to his father's name, yet old enough to understand fear when it came dressed as diplomacy. His father, Vlad II, known as Drawl, stood at a crossroads between the Hungarian crown and the Ottoman Empire, and the path he chose would destroy whatever innocence his son still carried. In exchange for keeping his fragile throne, he surrendered his two youngest boys, Vlad and Radu, to Sultan Murad II, not as prisoners in chains, but as hostages wearing silk, their small lives transformed into insurance for a political promise their father was too weak to keep on his own. The Ottomans did not confine the boys to darkness. They confined them to dependence. The palace, said Adorn, and later Amasya offered them tutors, languages, horsemanship, refined etiquette, and the Quran, all wrapped in a veneer of cultured civility that attempted to disguise the fact that these lessons were not acts of generosity, but tools of psychological colonization. Vlad spent his adolescence watching the machinery of empire, not from the viewpoint of a noble guest, but from the vantage point of a captive, forced to admire the system that held him. He witnessed public punishments carried out not simply to execute the guilty, but to impress a message upon the masses. He saw that fear was an instrument sharpened by repetition, ritual, and spectacle, and that domination was most effective when dressed in ceremony rather than chaos. while Radu absorbed these surroundings like a soft reed bending to the wind, charming, his captors befriending May and learning to thrive in their world. Vlad resisted at every turn, earning beatings, punishments, and the marks of a child who refused to surrender the last fragments of his autonomy. Those years carved deep fissures in him, layers of humiliation, helplessness, rage, and observation compressed into something sharp and unyielding. Ottoman chroniclers never fully recorded the details of his discipline, but even the fragments they preserved suggest a boy who endured the kind of psychological rupturing that in some individuals leads to despair and in others crystallizes into obsession. Vlad learned to watch with the cold detachment of someone forced to adapt or be consumed. He memorized the teachings of pain, not because he wished to replicate cruelty for its own sake, but because he recognized that terror, when meticulously planned, could reorder the world around the one who wielded it. He was discovering slowly and quietly that he did not fear fear itself. He feared powerlessness. When he finally returned to Wallachia at 17, he expected at least the comfort of family bonds to anchor him after years of forced loyalty and concealed bitterness. Instead, he walked into the remnants of a slaughtered dynasty. His father had been murdered by a boy who switched allegiances whenever it suited their ambitions, and his older brother, Miria, had been buried alive, a fate so horrific that even hardened soldiers whispered about it, as if discussing a curse. Vlad stood alone in a homeland that had become unfamiliar, surrounded by nobles who saw him not as a prince, but as a pawn to be manipulated or removed depending on their convenience. In that moment, every Ottoman lesson he had absorbed about control, fear, and psychological dominance took root with a clarity that reshaped him from a wounded adolescent into something far more dangerous. But transformation requires patience. For 6 years, Vlad disappeared into exile, moving through foreign courts, studying the structure of armies, observing how kings maintained order, and waiting with the quiet, cold focus of someone who believed fate owed him a reckoning. By 1456, when Hungarian backing finally placed Wallachia within his grasp again, he did not return as an uncertain youth molded by trauma. He returned as a man who intended to weaponize everything he had learned. He had not forgotten the Ottomans' cruelty, nor the boy's treachery, nor the helplessness that once hollowed him out. He would never feel powerless again, and the price for that resolve would be paid by anyone who dared to test him. When Vlad finally reclaimed the throne of Wallachia in 1456, the coronation was not a celebration of triumph, but the unveiling of a philosophy he had spent years refining in silence. The nobles, those polished architects of betrayal who had murdered his father, buried his brother alive, and treated rulers as disposable pieces on a game, Board arrived dressed in their finest silks, believing that another young prince would bow to their influence, just as so many before him had done. The great hall shimmered with music, wine, and the hollow laughter of men, convinced of their own invulnerability. Vlad let them enjoy that illusion for only as long as it took to expose the rot festering beneath their polished manners. When he stood and asked them how many princes they had served, the answers flowed with pride, each noble boasting of having survived reign after reign, as if endurance through treachery were a badge of honor rather than a confession of opportunism. Vlad listened with the calm of a man who had already decided their fates. And when they finished speaking, he gave the order that shattered the ceremony's facade and revealed the brutal logic that would define his rule. The older nobles, the ones whose hands were most stained with the shifting loyalties that had destroyed Wash's stability, were taken outside and impaled. Immediately, their screams rising over the walls like a grim overture to Vlad's new era of governance. But the younger boys, along with their families, were condemned to something far more grueling. Vlad ordered them stripped of their finery and forced into a march toward the ruins of Perry Castle, a fortress perched high in the mountains, long neglected and nearly forgotten. What awaited them was not imprisonment, but forced labor so severe it erased the line between punishment and annihilation. Day after day, they hauled stones up steep slopes, rebuilt broken walls with bleeding hands, and labored until exhaustion bent their backs and hunger hollowed their faces. Many died beneath the weight of the stones they carried. Others collapsed from fatigue and were replaced by those who learned too late that Vlad did not simply seek revenge. He sought the destruction of an entire noble class that had poisoned Wallachia for generations. Through this methodical dismantling of the Bozars, Vlad exposed a truth that many rulers never understood. Fear was most effective when it was not merely a tool of retribution, but a structural foundation upon which a ruler could build absolute authority. Once the old nobility had been crushed or reshaped into subservient shadows of their former selves, Vlad turned his attention outward, toward the empire that had shaped his childhood and humiliated him in ways he had never forgotten. When Ottoman envoys arrived to collect the annual tribute and insisted on keeping their turbans on, a deeply rooted tradition that symbolized religious respect, Vlad pretended to entertain their explanation with curiosity. He praised their devotion, acknowledged their custom, and then twisted it into a symbol of defiance so shocking that even the most hardened chroniclers recorded the event with unease. He ordered their turbans nailed to their skulls, not in a frenzied act of rage, but with deliberate precision meant to ensure their survival long enough to return to Constantinople. As walking embodiments of his contempt, what followed was not a chaotic reign of brutality, but the carefully orchestrated construction of a psychological weapon. Vlad understood that impalement was not merely a painful execution. It was a performance, a message, a spectacle designed to move through the imagination of his enemies faster than any army could move across land. He arranged victims according to social rank, impaling nobles higher than commoners, and commanders higher still, crafting a grotesque visual hierarchy that reflected the order he intended to impose upon his world. He placed the impaled where travelers would see them first, near marketplaces, city gates, river crossings, and major roads to ensure that no one entered or left Washa without bearing witness to his authority etched into human flesh. Rumors spread more quickly than merchants could spin their wheels, and Saxon printers translated fear into ink and paper, producing pamphlets filled with horrifying illustrations that exaggerated nothing because Vlad's reality was already beyond imagination. By the time the mutilated envoys reached Mem II, the Sultan understood with chilling clarity that Vlad was no longer the defiant boy he had known in his youth. He was encountering a ruler who had taken the Ottomans' own methods of psychological warfare and twisted them into an art form so severe that it bordered on ritual. Mehmed realized that diplomacy would fail, threats would fail, and even military superiority might not be enough against a man who manipulated fear with surgical precision. War became inevitable. But before the might of the Ottoman Empire could descend upon Wallachia with overwhelming force, Vlad prepared something the world had never seen before. A strategy not designed to win battles, but to warp the minds of those who dared march against him. When news reached Constantinople that Vlad had not only mutilated the Sultan's envoys, but had also begun launching his own raids across the Danube, raids so brutal that entire border settlements were left silent in their aftermath, Mehmed II finally recognized that he was no longer dealing with a rebellious vassal, but with an adversary who understood Ottoman psychology more intimately than most of his own commanders. Vlad's attacks were swift, merciless, and precisely calculated to inflict the maximum psychological rupture. Villages were burned to ash, garrisons wiped out, supply stations destroyed, and the survivors, when there were any left behind, only spread tales of a Washan prince who fought like a man carved from vengeance rather than flesh. In one particularly devastating campaign, Vlad himself recorded that he had killed tens of thousands, listing victims by age, gender, and profession in a cold tally that read less like a war report and more like a catalog of engineered terror. This was no longer defiance. This was a direct challenge to an empire that believed itself untouchable. For a ruler who had torn through the walls of Constantinople at 21, Ku commanded a military machine that dwarfed entire kingdoms and who believed destiny itself favored his rule. Mehmed could not allow such audacity to go unanswered. So he assembled a force so vast that even conservative accounts placed its numbers above 60,000, with some estimates stretching toward 90,000. This was not merely an expedition. It was a storm of infantry, cavalry, siege engineers, janissaries, artillery, and supply caravans extending so far behind the vanguard that from a distant hill it must have looked like a migrating nation rather than an army. Wakia, by comparison, was a thin line of 20 to 30,000 soldiers at most, many of them peasant levies with little formal training. A direct confrontation would have been a slaughter, and Vlad knew it. But he also knew something the Ottomans had not yet learned. The battlefield he intended to fight on was not one of swords and spears, but of nerves, nightmares, hunger, and exhaustion. The Ottomans marched into Wakia, expecting resistance. Yet, what they found instead was emptiness. Villages with doors left open, wells fouled with corpses, fields scorched to black earth, and roads devoid of life except for the eerie remnants of hurried flight. Vlad had evacuated entire regions, ordering his people into forests and mountains where they disappeared like smoke, denying the enemy every resource. With each passing day, the Sultan's soldiers grew more restless as supply lines stretched thin, and frustration became as common as hunger. And then, as night fell, the attacks began. They were not battles, but apparitions. Washin riders slipped in and out of the Ottoman camps under darkness, killing sentries before they could raise alarms, setting fire to tents, stampeding horses, disrupting supply wagons, and vanishing into the forest before the janissaries could organize a counterstrike. These nocturnal raids were not meant to defeat the army. They were meant to erode its sanity, to make every soldier question whether safety existed even within their own campfires. But the masterpiece of Vlad's campaign, the moment that would be etched into Ottoman memory long after generals died and empires shifted, was the night attack of June 17, 1462. Through captured soldiers and informants, Vlad learned the exact location of Mehmed's pavilion. Surrounded by elite janissaries who formed a living wall around their ruler, under the cover of a moonless sky, Vlad led nearly 10,000 men dressed in captured Ottoman uniforms. Their familiarity with Turkish commands was honed enough to cause confusion among sentries. They infiltrated the camp with the silence of a tide rising in darkness. And when they struck, the Ottoman encampment plunged into chaos so complete that even seasoned veterans faltered. Fires erupted across the tents, horses screamed and broke free in terror, and Washin soldiers cut through lines with ferocity, fueled not by numbers, but by desperation and intimate knowledge of Ottoman structure. For hours, battle raged through the darkness. Chronicles from both sides describe moments where the Wakians came within mere paces of the Sultan himself, with some accounts claiming that Vlad and Mehmed saw each other across the firelit confusion. Two men bound by a shared childhood, yet standing on opposite ends of fate. But the janissaries, drilled to fight even when death pressed against their throats, formed a protective ring that held firm long enough for the Sultan to escape the assassination intended to end him. As dawn crept over the horizon, Vlad realized that the moment had slipped beyond his grasp and ordered a withdrawal as swift as his advance. He and his soldiers faded into the forests like specters, leaving behind a camp strewn with bodies, shattered tents, and a psychological wound far deeper than the casualty count suggested. Although the Ottomans recorded their losses as modest, the truth was that the damage done that night could not be measured in corpses. The Sultan had nearly died in the heart of his own army, surrounded by tens of thousands of troops. That single fact fractured morale more effectively than any blade. Commanders questioned their security. Soldiers whispered of a prince who moved like a shadow, who materialized within fortresses and vanished before dawn, who fought not with numbers, but with terror sharpened into strategy. Every Ottoman march afterward felt like a step into an unseen trap. Yet they continued toward the Washin capital, pushing forward through a land stripped bare. exhausted by raids and haunted by uncertainty. And Vlad, who understood exactly how far the Ottomans would chase him, had prepared something to ensure that their final steps would be taken, not with confidence, but with dread powerful enough to shake an empire. By the time May's army pushed deeper into Waqia, they were already stretched thin. Exhausted from weeks of scorched earth, sleepless from relentless night raids, and unnerved by an enemy who refused to meet them in a traditional battlefield, soldiers marched with the hollow silence of men who no longer felt the ground beneath their feet belonged to the living. Every village they passed was deserted. Every road felt like a warning. Every forest whispered the possibility of ambush. Hunger coiled in their stomachs. Suspicion gnawed at their minds. The landscape itself felt hostile, as if Vlad had rearranged the very earth to conspire against them. And then, as they approached the capital, something far worse than starvation or fatigue greeted them. Something that not even the most battle-hardened janissaries could brace their hearts against. The first omen arrived on the wind. It was not the ordinary stench of battlefield death, but a suffocating, nauseating heaviness that made soldiers gag before they could understand why. Horses refused to continue. Scouts hesitated to dismount. Commanders wrapped cloth around their faces, unable to make sense of the overpowering scent that grew thicker with each step. As the army climbed a gentle rise toward the outskirts of Teravite, the horizon began to shimmer strangely in the heat. And then the truth revealed itself with a clarity so brutal that even the most disciplined ranks faltered. Before them stretched a landscape that had been transformed into a monument of horror, an expanse of impaled bodies that covered the valley like a grotesque tapestry sewn from human agony. No words, no warnings, and no rumors had prepared them for the scale of what Vlad had constructed. Even hardened veterans who had stood inside cities torn apart by war felt their knees weaken at the sight. The impaled were not scattered haphazardly. They were arranged with a precision that spoke of a mind more focused on psychological devastation than physical punishment. Thousands upon thousands of bodies, some already darkened by rot, others newly pierced and still trembling, rose on wooden stakes of varying heights. From afar, the formations resembled agricultural fields or ceremonial patterns. But as the army drew closer, the horrifying truth became impossible to ignore. The bodies had been organized according to rank and status. Common soldiers occupied the lower ranks. Officers rose higher. And at the center of this nightmarish geometry, positioned on the tallest stake like a macabre centerpiece, hung the corpse of Hamza Pasha, an Ottoman commander captured earlier in the campaign. His uniform, tattered but recognizable, fluttered weakly in the foul wind, and his body, though lifeless, maintained a final accusatory posture, as if reminding every soldier present what awaited them should they fail to retreat. Some victims had been dead for weeks, their skin bloated and splitting under the heat. Others appeared to have been impaled only hours before, their limbs still twitching with the final remnants of pain coursing through nerves that refused to die. Eyewitnesses later recalled that the moans drifting across the valley sounded less like human voices and more like the earth itself was crying. The smell was so overwhelming that entire formations turned away to vomit, while others covered their faces trembling, not from fear of battle, but from the knowledge that no ordinary human mind could conceive such a sight, let alone create it with such mathematical precision. Soldiers who had razed cities and slaughtered armies began whispering prayers they had long forgotten, gripping their weapons not with confidence, but with dread, as though at any moment the dead around them might rise and condemn them for trespassing into a realm shaped by madness. But it was not madness. That was the revelation that chilled them the most. The geometric patterns, the deliberate placement of bodies, and the careful selection of heights and distances all spoke of a ruthless calculation, designed to strike at the core of Ottoman pride. Vlad had not intended to merely punish prisoners. He had intended to break the morale of the greatest army of the age. The field of the impaled was not a battlefield. It was a message carved from suffering, a statement that no army, regardless of size, discipline, or glory, could march through Washia without paying a price that would linger in memory long after the campaign ended. Sultan Mehmed II, a man who had watched stone walls crumble beneath his cannons and had personally overseen massacres during his conquests, halted his horse at the site and stared in silence for several long moments. Chroniclers later recorded his words, spoken not with admiration, but with grim acknowledgement, that a ruler capable of constructing such an atrocity could not be defeated by conventional means. As he surveyed the valley, he understood that this was no longer a conflict measured in armies or terrain. This was a confrontation with a mind that manipulated terror with the precision of a military science. The Sultan's commanders urged caution. His soldiers whispered of omens. His officers debated whether advancing further would mean stepping into a trap from which none could return. Within days, the consensus among the army was no longer strategic. It was survival. The retreat was not announced with fanfare. It was murmured through the ranks like a prayer finally answered. The empire withdrew, not because they had been defeated in battle, but because Vlad had shattered something more vital than their formations. He had broken their will to continue. The field of the impaled accomplished what armies rarely achieve. It forced the most powerful military force in the world to turn back, acknowledging that the cost of advancing was not worth the victory awaiting them. You would expect that any ruler who managed to repel the greatest military machine of his age, who forced the Ottoman Empire to retreat, not through numbers, but through terror sharpened into a strategic instrument, would be hailed as a savior by the Christian world and embraced as a shield of Europe. In the immediate aftermath of May's withdrawal, that was partially true. Letters praising Vlad's defense spread among Western courts, and the Pope himself considered him a necessary bulwark against Ottoman expansion. Yet the men offering praise from distant cities did not live under Vlad's rule. Nor did they understand that the methods he used against his enemies did not simply dissipate once the danger passed. Vlad had forged terror into a governing principle, and once he had relied on that tool long enough, he could not simply lay it aside. Terror became not just a tactic, but a reflex, an instinct, and eventually a worldview through which he interpreted every challenge, every whisper, and every perceived disloyalty until fear ceased to be a weapon he wielded and instead became the very environment he built his kingdom upon. The same hands that had crushed the Bojars now turned toward merchants accused of price manipulation, peasants suspected of hiding goods, villagers rumored to be withholding loyalty, and even minor officials whose actions displeased him. In Vlad's mind, stability demanded absolute obedience. And absolute obedience could only be secured through the unrelenting presence of fear. What had begun as a calculated strategy to counter overwhelming odds against a foreign empire slowly transformed into a domestic system that devoured his own people. Wars once destroyed were replaced with new elites molded by terror. Yet, even these new loyalties proved fragile in a land where alliances shifted as quickly as rivers in a spring flood. Vlad's increasingly unpredictable actions frightened the very allies he had relied upon, including Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had once praised him as a defender of Christendom, but soon saw him as a political liability whose brutality tarnished diplomatic efforts and destabilized the fragile balance between states. When Vlad sought aid from Matthias in the aftermath of the Ottoman campaign, the Hungarian king found himself facing not only the logistical burden of supporting Walachia's volatile ruler, but also a trove of forged letters likely created by political rivals suggesting that Vlad was secretly negotiating with the Ottomans. Whether Matthias believed those letters or simply used them as an excuse to remove a dangerous ally, the result was the same. Vlad was arrested and kept in a form of gilded captivity for nearly 12 years. Ironically, those were perhaps the most peaceful years of his life. He was provided comfortable quarters, allowed to move within the Hungarian court, and eventually married a noblewoman who bore him children. The man who had once dominated Wallachia through terror found himself living in relative domesticity, a tamed version of the warlord who had carved forests out of human bodies. Yet beneath the calm surface, the intensity that had defined his earlier reign never truly disappeared. It simply lay dormant, waiting for the moment when Wallach's instability would once again call him back into the storm. That moment arrived in 1476, when Wallachia, worn down by weak rulers and internal conflict, looked once more for a figure capable of imposing order. With the support of Stephen the Great and a coalition of Hungarian and Moldavian forces, Vlad reclaimed the throne. But the stability he sought to impose could not be achieved in the fractured landscape that awaited him. Nor could his old methods craft enduring loyalty in a land that had grown weary of fear. His final reign lasted barely long enough for him to establish control before he was drawn back into the wars against the Ottomans. In either late 1476 or early 1477, sources disagree. Vlad died amid a chaotic battle. Some chroniclers claimed he was killed by Ottoman soldiers. Others insisted he was cut down by his own men in the confusion of combat, mistaken for an enemy as the fog of war overwhelmed discipline. Whatever the truth, the aftermath confirmed the bitterness of his legacy. His head was severed, preserved in honey, and sent to Memtu as proof of his death. The Sultan, who had once stared at Vlad's grotesque valley of impaled corpses, now gazed upon the head of the man who had engineered it. His body, reportedly buried at Snagov Monastery, vanished from history. Excavations, centuries later, uncovered an empty tomb, a fitting conclusion for a man whose life existed between reality and legend. In Romania, he would be remembered not as Dracula the monster, but as a defender who held back an empire. In the Western imagination, his story would be reshaped into supernatural tales of vampiric evil, which in many ways mercifully simplified the disturbing truth by turning a human being into a myth rather than facing the reality of what humanity can become under certain pressures. The true horror of Vlad's legacy lies not in the gruesome methods he employed, but in the stark reminder that such methods were not born out of madness, but out of reasoning shaped by trauma, desperation, and a world where power was often measured in cruelty rather than compassion. And that is the most unsettling truth. Vlad the Impaler was not an aberration of nature, but a reflection of it. Proof that under certain conditions, fear becomes a currency stronger than loyalty. Terror becomes a language more persuasive than diplomacy. And brutality becomes a strategy more effective than armies. His story endures because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question about history and human nature. If terror can shape empires, then what other horrors have gone unrecorded, concealed beneath the dust of forgotten centuries, waiting to reveal what people become when survival demands they abandon every boundary? 3.